The doctor asked a question that would change the rest of my life, and he didn't look at me when he asked it. He looked at my sister. The room was small and painfully bright, the kind of hospital room where every surface reflected light back at you. The air smelled like disinfectant, and something metallic underneath it. I was sitting upright, fully awake, my hands folded in my lap, listening closely. I hadn't been sedated. I hadn't been confused. I was there. But when the doctor explained the next step, the risks, the permanence of it, my sister answered before I could even inhale. "Yes," she said calmly. "We've already talked about this. This is what's best." The nurse nodded. The doctor made a note. No one questioned the word "we." I remember the exact moment I realized I had disappeared. It wasn't dramatic. No one raised their voice. No one told me to be quiet. They simply continued, as if the most important decision about my body and my future had already been settled somewhere I hadn't been invited. I sat there, listening to my life being summarized by someone else, and understood that if I didn't do something very carefully, I was about to lose more than a medical choice. I was about to lose the right to speak for myself. My sister sat across from me, her posture relaxed, her voice steady. She had always been good at this. Good at sounding prepared, good at sounding reasonable. She spoke in complete sentences, used the right terms, asked the kind of questions people trust. She looked like someone who belonged in charge. I looked like someone who needed help. That's how it always worked. The doctor explained the procedure again, slower this time, and still didn't look at me. He spoke to my sister as if I were a file on the table between us. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, not panic, but recognition. This wasn't confusion, this was a pattern. My sister nodded along, occasionally adding details I hadn't said out loud. She talked about my condition, my limitations, my stress levels. She talked about how tired I'd been lately, how overwhelmed, how grateful I was to have her handle things. I noticed how smoothly she used my name while erasing my presence. No one asked me if I agreed. No one asked me if I had questions. The assumption hovered in the room like an unspoken rule. If my sister was speaking, it must be because she was supposed to. I could have interrupted. I felt the urge rise up in my throat, sharp and immediate. I could have said, "I'm right here." I could have said, "That's not what I decided." I could have forced every eye in the room back onto me. But I didn't. I had learned over years what happened when I reacted too fast. When I spoke with emotion instead of precision, I became difficult, sensitive, someone whose judgment could be questioned. My sister knew that too. She kept talking, gently but firmly, steering the conversation toward conclusions instead of options. She spoke as if everything had already been discussed in private, as if I had given my consent somewhere earlier and simply forgotten. I watched the nurse's pen move across the paper. I watched the doctor's cursor blink on the screen. I watched the system accept my sister's authority without asking for proof. And that's when my attention shifted, not to my sister's voice, but to the folder on the desk. It was thick, tabbed, neatly organized. Forms were stacked in a specific order, some clipped, some loose. A consent page sat near the top, its signature line still blank. I noticed it because it wasn't where it should have been. The order was wrong. I didn't know yet what that meant, only that it mattered. My sister was speaking as if decisions had already been finalized, but the paperwork hadn't caught up with her story. The system she relied on hadn't confirmed what she was claiming. I stayed quiet. The doctor asked another question, again directing it to her. She answered with confidence, but I heard a subtle shift in her tone, just enough to tell me she was aware the conversation had gone far, too far to turn back easily. I felt the weight of the moment press down on me. This wasn't a routine appointment. The words being used weren't reversible ones. Once certain steps were taken, there would be no undoing them. I understood that clearly. And still, I didn't speak. Silence in that room was not surrender. It was calculation. I needed to know how far my sister was willing to go if no one stopped her. I needed to see whether her authority came from truth or from assumption. I needed the system to reveal itself before I challenged it. My sister finished her explanation and smiled, a small, reassuring expression she had perfected over time, the kind that said everything was under control. The doctor nodded again and turned toward the paperwork. As the conversation moved forward, I realized something with sudden clarity. This wasn't just about medicine. It wasn't even just about control. It was about who everyone believed had the right to decide my life. And if I didn't reclaim that right carefully, deliberately, and at the exact right moment, I might never get it back. I stayed quiet long after the doctor turned back to his screen, but my mind didn't stay in that room. It moved backward, not in a rush, not in a spiral, but with a clarity that surprised me. What had just happened didn't feel new. It felt familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. This wasn't the first time my sister had spoken for me. It was simply the first time the stakes were high enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. I remembered a phone call from months earlier, the kind you put on speaker without thinking. A billing office had called with a question about my account. I reached for the phone, but my sister was already answering, already explaining. She spoke quickly, confidently, told them she had everything handled. When she hung up, she smiled and said, "It was faster this way. You looked tired." At the time, I let it go. That memory slid into another, smaller but sharper. A form I hadn't recognized arriving in the mail, already signed when I found it on the kitchen counter. My name was there, written neatly, but the pressure was wrong. The curve of the letters felt unfamiliar. When I asked about it, my sister waved it off. "You asked me to take care of it," she said. "Don't you remember?" I hadn't argued then either. Each moment on its own had seemed harmless, helpful even. She was organized. She liked to manage things. Everyone said so. My parents praised her for being responsible, for stepping up, for carrying the weight when others couldn't. I absorbed that narrative without questioning where it placed me. The pattern only became visible when I stopped looking at the moments individually. My sister didn't take control all at once. She took it in pieces, wrapped in concern and efficiency. She answered questions before I had time to process them. She volunteered explanations I hadn't offered. She made decisions sound temporary, then treated them as permanent once no one objected. And I rarely did. Part of it was exhaustion. Part of it was trust. And part of it was something harder to admit. Arguing never seemed worth the cost. Every time I pushed back, the response was the same. I was told I was overthinking, overreacting, being emotional. The conversation would shift away from the issue and toward my tone, my stress, my sensitivity. So I learned to step back. The family learned to step around me. By the time we were sitting in that hospital room, my sister's role felt established. She was the one who knew the details, the one who talked to professionals, the one who could be counted on to make the tough calls. I was the one who needed support, who benefited from having someone else handle things. No one said it outright, they didn't have to. As I replayed the appointment in my head, one detail stood out more clearly than the rest. It wasn't what my sister had said. It was how prepared she had been. She didn't hesitate once. She didn't check with me, even with a glance. She spoke as if the decisions were settled facts, not ongoing conversations. That level of certainty doesn't come from improvisation. It comes from expectation. I realized then that she hadn't just stepped into authority. She had been living there for a while, unchecked. Every time I stayed quiet, every time the family deferred to her, every time a form went unchallenged, that authority solidified. And authority, once normalized, doesn't like being questioned. What unsettled me most was not the control itself, but the calm with which it had been exercised. There was no anger in her voice, no urgency. She wasn't forcing anything. She was guiding the process, gently but decisively, trusting that no one would interrupt her, including me. The thought landed heavily. What did she gain by controlling the narrative? It wasn't just convenience, it wasn't just habit. People don't prepare that thoroughly without a reason. They don't assume that level of permission unless they believe it belongs to them. I thought about the paperwork again. about dates and signatures and the way things had quietly shifted from my hands to hers. I thought about how easy it would be for a system to accept her authority if no one insisted on seeing proof. And then I understood something that steadied me instead of frightening me. If her control depended on assumption, then assumption was also its weakness. I didn't need to confront her, not yet. I didn't need to accuse or explain. I needed clarity. I needed facts. I needed to let the structure she relied on reveal what she had been counting on no one to check. That realization changed how I felt sitting in that hospital room. The pressure didn't disappear, but it sharpened into something usable. Silence stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like space. The conversation inside the room continued without me, but I was no longer lost in it. I was listening differently now, not for reassurance, but for inconsistencies. For moments where confidence outpaced documentation, I knew the decision being discussed carried consequences far beyond the appointment. Once certain paths were chosen, they would shape everything that came after. Health, autonomy, legal standing, the future I would be allowed to have. And I knew this much for certain. If I let this continue unchecked, I wouldn't just lose my voice for one afternoon. I would lose it everywhere that mattered. So I stayed still. I let my sister speak. I let the system move forward. And I waited for the moment when the story she'd been telling would have to meet the record that didn't belong to her. The doctor lowered his voice slightly, the way people do when what they're about to say can't be taken back. He explained the next step again, slower, more carefully, choosing words that carried weight without sounding alarming. I caught phrases like long-term impact, not easily reversed, and quality of life. The room seemed to shrink around those words, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. This wasn't a routine appointment. It wasn't a discussion meant to be revisited later over coffee or postponed until someone felt ready. This was the kind of decision that drew a line through the future and asked you to step across it without hesitation. My sister didn't hesitate. She nodded at the right moments, interjected with quiet confidence, clarified points before anyone asked. She spoke as though the risks had already been weighed, the alternatives already dismissed. Her certainty filled the space where my voice should have been. I noticed how the doctor responded to that certainty. He relaxed. He stopped explaining as much. Professionals trust people who sound like they've done the thinking already. It saves time. It simplifies things. It also removes the need to ask the person most affected. As the explanation continued, I felt a shift inside me, a tightening that had nothing to do with fear. I wasn't overwhelmed. I wasn't confused. I understood exactly what was being discussed, and I understood something else even more clearly. This decision would follow me long after we left this room. It would affect what I could choose later, what I could refuse, what would require permission instead of preference. It wasn't just about my health. It was about my autonomy, folded neatly into medical language that made it sound inevitable. My sister leaned forward slightly, hands clasped, listening as if she were the one being asked to bear the consequences. She asked a question about timing, about what came next. She didn't ask if I was ready. The nurse glanced at the screen, then back at my sister, answering her as if the chain of command had already been established. I saw it then, unmistakably. This wasn't collaboration. This was substitution. And the system was cooperating. There was a phrase the doctor used, almost in passing, that made my pulse jump. Once we proceed. It was followed by another. Permanent change. Those words didn't land on my sister the way they landed on me. I felt them settle in my chest, heavy and exact. This was the point of no return. The line I couldn't cross blindly, no matter how calm the room appeared. For the first time, my silence felt dangerous. I thought about speaking then, about stopping the conversation and pulling it back into questions instead of conclusions. But I also saw how quickly that would change the tone, how fast concern would turn into doubt, and doubt into scrutiny of my stability rather than the plan itself. I stayed quiet, but I listened harder. That's when I noticed something small, something almost invisible if you weren't looking for it. The nurse mentioned a protocol, a routine requirement tied to decisions of this kind. She phrased it casually, as if it were already understood. My sister nodded too quickly. The words didn't match the confidence. There was a fraction of a second where her certainty lagged behind the process, where she had to catch up instead of leading. It was subtle, but it was real. The system had rules. Rules didn't care how confident you sounded. I didn't react. I didn't look at my sister or at the nurse. I let the moment pass, but I stored it carefully. A discrepancy didn't mean much on its own, but it meant something important to me. It meant there was a framework here, one that didn't bend for tone or familiarity. The doctor moved on, outlining next steps, mentioning paperwork, verification, timelines. The conversation edged closer to formality, to things that required signatures instead of agreement. I realized then that words had carried my sister this far, but words alone wouldn't carry her any further. That understanding steadied me. The urgency didn't disappear, but it shifted. I no longer felt trapped by the moment. I felt alert, waiting for the right opening rather than fighting for space. My sister continued to speak, but there was a new tension under her calm. She was careful now, choosing phrases that sounded less final, less absolute. It told me she felt it too, even if she didn't know why yet. The doctor reached for the folder. Paper made a quiet sound as it moved across the desk. The nurse adjusted her chair. The room's focus shifted away from voices and toward records, from narrative to procedure. I felt something click into place. This was no longer about convincing anyone of anything. It was about alignment, about whether the story my sister had been telling matched what existed in black and white, about whether authority had been granted or merely assumed. I didn't need to ask questions yet. I didn't need to challenge her version of events. I needed the process to continue exactly as it was, long enough to reveal its own boundaries. As the doctor began to review the file, I understood how narrow the path ahead was. One wrong move, one emotional interruption, and I could still lose control of the situation. The system might retreat back to what felt easiest, most familiar. So I stayed still. The decision being discussed had not been finalized. Not yet. It lived in the space between intention and execution, between assumption and proof. And in that space, for the first time since the appointment began, I knew I had leverage. I just had to wait for the moment when the paperwork caught up to the certainty that had gotten us here. I felt the moment closing in on me, the kind that demands a reaction and punishes you for choosing the wrong one. The doctor's hand hovered over the folder. The nurse adjusted the screen so it faced my sister more directly. Everything in the room suggested momentum, a quiet agreement that the next step was already underway. If I was going to speak, this was when people expected it. I didn't. The urge to interrupt rose sharply, instinctive and urgent. I could feel it in my throat, the familiar pressure of words lining up behind my teeth. A single sentence would have done it. I could have reminded them I was present, alert, capable. I could have corrected my sister's assumptions in real time. But I knew what that would cost me. I had seen it before, too many times to pretend otherwise. The moment I spoke with emotion, the focus would shift, not to what I was saying, but to how I was saying it. Concern would replace clarity. Questions would turn inward, circling my state of mind instead of the decision on the table. My sister understood that dynamic better than anyone. She kept her tone measured, her posture relaxed. She looked exactly like someone acting in my best interest. If I challenged her now, especially with urgency in my voice, I would look like the unstable variable in an otherwise orderly process. So I stayed quiet, not because I agreed, but because I refused to lose credibility before I needed it most. As the conversation continued, I began to see the roles as clearly as if they'd been written down somewhere. My sister was the capable one, the organizer, the interpreter of complex information. I was the one who needed help, who benefited from having decisions simplified. Those roles hadn't been assigned in this room. They'd been rehearsed over years, reinforced by small choices and unchallenged assumptions. And the system had learned them well. Something shifted inside me as I watched it play out. I stopped caring whether they understood me. I stopped hoping my sister would pause and include me. I let go of the need to be seen as reasonable or cooperative. In its place, something steadier took hold. Accuracy. If I was going to reclaim control, it wouldn't be through volume or insistence. It would be through precision, through letting the process reach the point where truth mattered more than tone. My attention drifted again to the paperwork. The folder sat open now, its contents spread neatly across the desk. Consent forms, authorization pages, documents arranged in an order that suggested familiarity, not scrutiny. I watched how the doctor's eyes moved, how he scanned instead of reading closely. This was routine for him. He expected confirmation, not contradiction. That expectation was my advantage. I noticed a procedural detail that didn't sit right. The sequence of forms suggested a step had already been completed, but the signatures didn't support it. There was a gap, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't proof yet, but it was a question waiting to be asked. I said nothing. The longer I stayed quiet, the more the room adjusted around that silence. My sister began to fill it, adding context where none had been requested, reinforcing points that hadn't been challenged. Her voice carried a hint of urgency now, just enough to tell me she felt the conversation tightening. Silence has a way of doing that. It draws attention without demanding it. I understood in that moment that being misunderstood was a risk I had to accept. To them, my quiet might look like compliance. To my sister, it might look like retreat. I let those assumptions stand. Short-term misinterpretation was a small price for long-term control. The nurse asked a clarifying question, something procedural, something neutral. My sister answered quickly, but the answer felt rehearsed rather than grounded. I watched the nurse's expression flicker, professional and unreadable, as she made a note. That was the first real advantage I felt settle into place. Words could move a conversation forward, but they couldn't finalize anything on their own, not here. Not without the right signatures, the right designations, the right authority clearly documented. And none of that could happen without me. I had been sitting in that room for the entire appointment, fully capable, fully present. The system hadn't removed my authority, it had simply failed to verify it. That distinction mattered. The doctor began to speak again, summarizing what would need to happen next. His tone was careful, procedural. He mentioned verification, review, making sure everything was in order before proceeding. It sounded routine, but I heard the shift beneath it. The process was slowing down. My sister noticed it too. Her posture straightened. She smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes this time. Control was no longer automatic. It had become conditional. I stayed focused on the details, on the way the conversation was bending away from assumption and toward confirmation. This was the point where impatience could ruin everything, where speaking too soon could close the window that had just opened. So I stayed still. I let the system do what it was designed to do when certainty met procedure. I let it pause, reconsider, verify. I let my sister's authority rest on the one thing she couldn't fabricate on the spot. Proof. As the doctor reached for another document, I felt a quiet certainty take hold. Not relief, not triumph, just clarity. The truth didn't need me to announce it. It only needed the space to surface. And for the first time since I'd walked into that room, I understood that my silence wasn't leaving me behind. It was placing me exactly where I needed to be. The room went quiet in a different way when the doctor finally turned his attention to the file. Conversation slowed, then stopped altogether, replaced by the soft sounds of paper shifting and keys clicking. The authority that had been carried by my sister's voice moments earlier now rested on the desk between us, flattened into forms and checkboxes and dates. This was the part she trusted most. The doctor began with the assumptions everyone seemed to share. Authorized representative, prior consent, documented agreement. He said it as if reading from a familiar script, one he'd followed hundreds of times before. My sister sat back, her confidence returning, the tension in her shoulders easing as the process moved into territory she believed was already secured. I stayed still. The nurse pulled up a digital record and scrolled, her eyes moving quickly, efficiently. The doctor leaned closer, scanning rather than reading, trusting that everything would align the way it usually did. That trust had carried my sister a long way. Then the scrolling slowed. The nurse stopped and adjusted the screen, her finger hovering over a line longer than necessary. She frowned slightly, not in concern but in concentration. It was the kind of pause professionals make when something isn't where it's supposed to be. "There's no recent authorization here," she said evenly. The sentence landed without drama, without accusation. It wasn't directed at me. It wasn't even directed at my sister, not really. It was simply stated, like an observation about the weather. My sister leaned forward. "It should be there," she said, her tone still calm. "We took care of that." The nurse nodded and continued searching. I felt the shift then, subtle but unmistakable. The room had stopped accepting explanations and started asking for confirmation. Words no longer carried weight on their own. They had to be anchored to something visible. I kept my eyes on the desk. The doctor cleared his throat and pointed to a page. "This designation expired," he said, more to the record than to any of us. "It hasn't been updated." My sister smiled, a practiced expression meant to smooth over inconvenience. "That must be a clerical issue," she said. "We've been operating under the same arrangement." The nurse didn't argue. She simply kept scrolling. Another pause, then another. "There's no signature here," she said finally. "Not within the required time frame." My sister's smile tightened. She shifted in her chair, adjusting her posture as if that alone might realign the moment. "I've been handling everything," she said, a touch more firmly now. "Nothing has changed." I didn't look at her. I didn't look at the nurse or the doctor. I let the absence sit between us, heavy and undeniable. This was what silence had been building toward, a space where the system had to reconcile certainty with evidence. The nurse clicked into another section, her movements careful, deliberate. Dates appeared on the screen, neatly arranged, telling a story no one had been narrating out loud. A pattern emerged, not all at once but clearly enough to change the air in the room. The authority my sister had claimed didn't exist where it mattered. No one said that explicitly. They didn't need to. The doctor leaned back slightly, his expression shifting from assumption to consideration. "We'll need to verify this," he said, his voice measured, "before we proceed with anything." My sister nodded quickly, too quickly. "Of course," she said, "I can clarify." But the system had already moved past clarification. It wanted proof. I felt a strange calm settle over me, not relief, but recognition. The facts were doing exactly what I'd hoped they would. They were standing on their own, unbothered by tone or intent. The nurse turned the screen slightly, angling it so the doctor could see more clearly. In doing so, she also angled it toward me. It was the first time anyone in the room had physically oriented information in my direction. I didn't react. I watched as the doctor traced a finger down the list of entries, his brow furrowing in quiet concentration. He didn't ask my sister to explain anymore. He didn't ask anyone to fill the silence. He simply followed the trail where it led. "This designation was never renewed," he said finally, "and there's no current consent on file." My sister opened her mouth, then closed it again. The words she'd been relying on didn't fit anymore. They had nothing to attach themselves to. The nurse looked up, her gaze shifting for the first time from the screen to me. It wasn't a question yet. It was acknowledgement, a recognition that the record belonged to the person sitting quietly in the room, not the one who'd been speaking the loudest. I met her eyes briefly, then looked back down. Silence at this point was no longer absence. It was confirmation. The doctor folded his hands together and nodded once, decisively. "We'll need to pause here," he said. "Before any decisions are made, we'll have to hear directly from the patient." The sentence wasn't harsh. It wasn't corrective. It was procedural. And it changed everything. My sister leaned back in her chair, the confidence she'd carried in with her finally slipping. She tried to recover it, smoothing her expression, but the room no longer responded the way it had before. Authority had shifted, not with a confrontation, but with a record. I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded. The system hadn't taken my side out of sympathy or persuasion. It had done what it was designed to do when assumption failed. It had asked for verification. As the nurse began outlining next steps, speaking slowly, carefully, I understood something with absolute clarity. The story my sister had been telling depended on no one checking. The moment they did, it unraveled on its own. I remained quiet as the process reset itself around me, but this time, the silence belonged to me. And for the first time since the appointment began, the outcome no longer rested on what anyone claimed. It rested on what could be proven. The question itself was simple, almost harmless, which is what made it so dangerous. The nurse looked at my sister and asked for confirmation of the authorization date. Not an accusation, not a challenge, just a procedural check, the kind meant to close a loop before moving forward. My sister didn't answer right away. It was less than a second, barely noticeable if you weren't watching for it. But I was. I saw the pause land in her expression, the way her eyes flicked downward before returning to the nurse's face. When she spoke, her voice was still calm, but it no longer flowed. It had edges now. "It was handled some time ago," she said. "We've been operating under the same understanding." Understanding wasn't the word the system was asking for. The nurse nodded politely, typing as my sister spoke, but her eyes stayed on the screen. The doctor leaned forward again, closer than before, his attention narrowing. He wasn't listening to tone anymore. He was looking for alignment. That was when the room began to notice what I had already seen. The questions slowed. Follow-ups appeared where there hadn't been any before. The pace shifted from agreement to examination. It didn't feel confrontational. It felt careful, like people stepping onto unfamiliar ground. My sister sensed it too. She adjusted her posture, crossing and uncrossing her hands, adding context no one had requested. Each sentence was an attempt to regain the certainty she'd walked in with. I stayed quiet. There was a moment when I almost spoke, when instinct urged me to clarify, to help the process along. But I stopped myself just in time. If I interrupted now, it would redirect attention back to personality, back to emotion. It would give her something to lean against. Silence kept the focus where it belonged. The nurse clicked into another section of the record, her fingers precise, practiced. "This authorization doesn't extend past that date," she said neutrally, "and there's no updated consent attached." My sister nodded again, but this time the gesture was stiff. "That must be an oversight," she said. "We didn't realize it needed to be renewed." The doctor didn't respond immediately. He studied the screen, his mouth set in a thin line, the way people look when they're recalculating something they thought they understood. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't skeptical. He was adjusting. Authority, when it begins to crack, doesn't shatter all at once. It softens first. I noticed how my sister's voice changed as she continued to speak. She stopped stating things as facts and started phrasing them as explanations. Her confidence shifted into persuasion, her certainty into reassurance. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The system didn't respond to persuasion. The nurse referenced a specific record, something tied to an earlier decision. My sister leaned in to look at the screen, her brows drawing together. She opened her mouth to respond, then hesitated again. This pause was longer. The room went still. Even the hum of the equipment seemed to recede. The nurse waited, not impatiently, but expectantly. She wasn't trying to catch my sister in anything. She was simply waiting for an answer that fit. It didn't come. "I don't have that information in front of me," my sister said finally. The sentence changed everything. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a confession. It was an admission that her authority had limits, and that those limits had been reached. The doctor straightened slightly and folded his hands. "We'll need to verify this before proceeding," he said, his voice even. "Especially given the nature of the decision." My sister nodded, her smile returning out of habit rather than confidence. "Of course," she said. "I understand." But I could see it now, the thing she couldn't say out loud. Understanding wasn't enough anymore. The system wanted confirmation, and she couldn't provide it. For the first time since we'd entered the room, someone looked directly at me. It was brief, almost accidental. But it happened. The nurse's eyes met mine for a moment before returning to the screen. She didn't ask me anything yet. She didn't need to. The acknowledgement alone was enough to shift something deep inside me. I was no longer a background detail. The doctor spoke again, outlining the need to review earlier authorizations and decision-making history. He framed it as standard procedure, something that ensured patient protection. He used neutral language, but the implication was clear. The past was about to matter. My sister listened without interrupting, her expression carefully controlled. She no longer tried to guide the conversation. She followed it. That alone told me how far the balance had shifted. I remained silent, but my silence felt different now. It wasn't strategic restraint anymore, it was alignment. The process was finally doing what it was meant to do, and I didn't need to interfere. As the nurse prepared to pull older records, I understood what was coming next. The decisions that had once been framed as temporary, convenient, and harmless were about to be examined in full. The assumptions that had carried my sister's authority forward were about to meet a timeline they couldn't survive. I didn't feel anticipation so much as certainty. Whatever had been quietly normalized over time could not withstand scrutiny. Not now. Not with the system paying attention. My sister sat back in her chair, hands folded tightly in her lap, waiting. The confidence she had brought into the room had thinned into something fragile, something dependent on what the records would reveal. I sat still, my posture unchanged, my expression neutral. The story she had been telling was beginning to crack, not because anyone challenged it, but because it could no longer stand on its own. And as the nurse opened the next file, I knew we were no longer talking about what would happen next. We were about to confront what had already happened. And that was where the truth had been waiting all along. The room paused in a way that felt deliberate, as if time itself had been asked to step back while the records caught up. The nurse explained that they would need to review earlier authorizations, decisions made before this appointment, anything that established who had been speaking on my behalf and since when. Her voice was calm, procedural, but the effect was immediate. The present could not move forward without the past being examined. As she mentioned a date from several years ago, something inside me shifted. That date wasn't just a number, it was a doorway. My mind went back to the first time my sister had stepped in just for now. It had been during a stressful period, one of those moments families later describe as a blur. I had been overwhelmed, juggling too many things at once, trying to keep my footing while pretending I didn't need help. She had offered to handle a phone call, then a form, then a meeting I didn't feel strong enough to attend. "Just temporarily," she'd said, "until you're back on your feet." At the time, it sounded reasonable, comforting even. I remember feeling relieved that someone else was willing to shoulder the responsibility. I trusted her. She was my sister. She cared about me. Everyone said so. The authorization I signed back then was framed as limited, specific, a safety net, not a handover. I remember hesitating before signing, asking if it would need to be revisited later. "We'll fix it when things settle," she'd replied. "This is just to get through the hard part." Things did settle. What never happened was the fixing. That temporary permission was never formally closed. It wasn't renewed, but it wasn't revoked either. It simply lingered, existing in a gray space where assumptions could grow. My sister continued acting as if the authority carried forward automatically, and no one ever challenged it, including me. Each time she stepped in after that, it felt like a continuation, not an escalation. She spoke to doctors, lawyers, administrators. She handled details I didn't want to revisit. She made decisions sound like extensions of earlier ones, all connected, all justified by that original moment of vulnerability. I didn't realize how thoroughly that single act had reshaped our dynamic. As the flashback settled into focus, something else became clear. That arrangement hadn't just helped her help me. It had helped her in ways I hadn't considered at the time. Decisions moved faster. Conversations went through her. Information passed through her hands first. Control, once centralized, rarely returns itself voluntarily. I had mistaken her efficiency for generosity. I had mistaken her certainty for care. The nurse's voice brought me back to the present. She was scrolling through older records now, confirming dates, cross-checking designations. I could see the concentration on her face, the way she followed the trail with professional detachment. This wasn't about family dynamics to her. It was about whether the authority claimed matched what had been granted. My sister sat very still. Her posture was composed, but her hands were clasped tightly together, the way people hold themselves when they know there's nothing left to add. She didn't interrupt. She didn't explain. She waited. For the first time, we were both waiting on the same thing. I understood then what the records would show. Not malice, not forgery, just a quiet lapse that had been allowed to stretch far beyond its original purpose. A temporary solution treated as permanent because it was never challenged. The kind of thing that happens all the time when no one asks the right questions. The nurse stopped scrolling and nodded slightly, as if confirming something to herself. She didn't speak yet. She glanced at the doctor, then back at the screen, ensuring the sequence was clear. The silence that followed was heavier than before. My sister avoided my gaze. I didn't look at her either. There was nothing to gain from that exchange now. Whatever this was going to become, it would be shaped by process, not by emotion. The doctor cleared his throat and explained, gently but firmly, that earlier authorizations did not extend indefinitely, that without renewal or clear documentation, authority could not be assumed. His tone carried no judgment, only correction. My sister nodded once, slowly. I felt no rush of triumph, no surge of vindication. What I felt instead was alignment. Everything that had confused me before, every moment where I'd wondered whether I was imagining things, settled into place. I hadn't been overreacting. I hadn't been ungrateful. I had simply been operating inside a structure that no longer served me. The nurse turned slightly in her chair, repositioning herself so the next part of the conversation would require a different orientation. I noticed that she angled her body away from my sister and closer toward me, not fully yet, but enough to signal what was coming. The past had finished doing its work. What remained was the present, waiting to be addressed properly. As the doctor prepared to move forward, I sensed my sister's understanding shift. She knew now that the authority she'd relied on wasn't something she could reclaim with explanation. It had existed because no one had examined it closely. Now it had been examined. The room didn't feel hostile. It felt resolved, as if a misalignment had been corrected quietly, efficiently, without anyone needing to be blamed. That, more than anything, confirmed how fragile her control had always been. I sat there, composed, breathing evenly, no longer needing to rehearse anything in my head. The spotlight was about to move, and this time it would land exactly where it should have from the beginning. The room settled into a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes right before something irreversible happens. The nurse finished reviewing the records and turned her chair slightly, not toward my sister this time, but toward the center of the room. The doctor followed her movement, folding his hands together as if closing one chapter before opening another. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then the nurse said it, calmly, evenly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "We'll need to hear directly from the patient." The sentence didn't carry accusation. It wasn't sharp or corrective. It was procedural, almost gentle. but the effect was immediate and unmistakable. The air in the room shifted, as if gravity itself had changed direction. My sister froze. She didn't argue, she didn't interrupt, she didn't even look surprised. She simply stopped moving, her posture held in a careful stillness that told me she understood exactly what had just happened. The doctor turned his chair, aligning himself fully toward me for the first time since we'd walked in. His expression was neutral, professional, attentive, not cautious, not skeptical, present. I felt something in my chest loosen, not because the pressure was gone, but because it finally had somewhere to go. The nurse adjusted the screen again, angling it so I could see it clearly. This time the movement wasn't incidental. It was intentional. Information that had once flowed past me was now being offered directly. "How are you feeling about the options we discussed?" the doctor asked. The question was simple, clear, and it was unmistakably mine. For a moment I didn't answer, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I understood the weight of this pause. Silence had carried me this far. Now, the way I broke it mattered just as much as the fact that I did. I glanced briefly at my sister. She was staring at the table, her expression composed but distant, as if she were already somewhere else. The role she'd been performing no longer had a place in this exchange. I turned my attention back to the doctor. "I'd like to take a moment," I said. My voice was steady, not defensive, not emotional. "I need to review everything myself before making a decision." The nurse nodded immediately, making a note. The doctor didn't hesitate. "Of course," he said. "That's completely appropriate." The ease of his response surprised me more than anything else. There was no resistance, no concern about delay, no suggestion that I was complicating things. The system had been waiting for this input all along. My sister shifted slightly in her chair, a small movement that betrayed more than any words could have. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Whatever she had been preparing to say no longer fit the room. The nurse began outlining next steps, directing every word to me: options, timelines, resources. She spoke carefully, checking in to make sure I understood, pausing when I needed clarification. Each pause felt like a restoration of something that had been missing. I answered when necessary, briefly and precisely. I didn't explain my reasoning in depth. I didn't justify my caution. I didn't reference what had just happened. I stayed focused on what came next. The process moved forward smoothly, recalibrated without friction. As the conversation continued, I became aware of how different it felt to be addressed directly. Not just included, but centered. My questions were answered without being rerouted. My responses were recorded without being interpreted by someone else. This was what autonomy looked like in practice. Quiet, ordinary, undeniable. My sister remained silent. Her silence was no longer strategic. It was circumstantial. There was nothing for her to add that wouldn't expose the absence of authority she'd been relying on. I didn't take any satisfaction in that. I simply observed it, the same way I'd observed everything else. Control, I was learning, didn't need to be reclaimed loudly. It simply needed to be acknowledged where it belonged. The doctor summarized the plan, repeating it back to me to ensure accuracy. When he finished, he asked if there was anything else I wanted to address. I shook my head. "Not right now," I said. "This is enough." He smiled slightly. Not at my sister. At me. "We'll proceed accordingly," he said. As the appointment drew to a close, the nurse gathered the paperwork, placing it neatly back into the folder. She handed me a copy of the relevant forms, meeting my eyes as she did so. "If you have any questions later," she said, "please contact us directly." Directly. The word lingered with me as we stood to leave. My sister walked beside me out of the room, her steps measured, her expression unreadable. The hallway outside felt brighter, louder, full of movement that had nothing to do with us. Life continuing, indifferent to the shift that had just taken place. We didn't speak. I didn't need to. The silence between us was different now. It no longer pressed down on me. It no longer erased me. It existed because there was nothing left to say. As we reached the elevator, I realized something with a clarity that felt almost physical. For the first time since this appointment began, the outcome was no longer hanging in the balance. It had landed. Not with force, not with conflict, but with recognition. They had looked at me. They had listened. And from that moment on, no decision could be made without my voice at the center of it. The silence I carried with me now wasn't protective. It was mine. The room waited for me in a way it never had before. Not with impatience, not with expectation, but with a stillness that felt intentional. The doctor had finished speaking. The nurse's pen hovered just above the page. Every movement paused, as if the next sound needed permission to exist. I let the silence hold. I understood something in that moment that had taken me years to learn. When you've been spoken over long enough, people expect you to rush when you're finally invited in. They expect relief, emotion, explanation. They expect you to fill the space as proof that you deserved it. I didn't. I took a breath, slow and measured, and kept my eyes on the doctor. Not my sister, not the paperwork. The person who now needed to hear me directly. "I'm not ready to proceed today," I said. The words were simple, flat, unadorned. I didn't explain why. I didn't reference what had just happened. I didn't say how long it had taken me to reclaim that sentence. I just stated what was true. The nurse nodded immediately and wrote it down exactly as I said it. No paraphrasing, no softening. The doctor didn't hesitate either. "That's your decision," he replied. "We'll document it." Something in my chest loosened. Not because I'd won, but because nothing pushed back. The system accepted my answer the way it should have from the beginning. Calmly, respectfully, without requiring justification. My sister shifted beside me. It was a small movement, but I felt it. She inhaled as if preparing to speak, then stopped herself. Whatever words she'd been holding no longer had a place to land. I didn't turn to look at her. This moment wasn't about her reaction. It was about my boundary, and boundaries lose their power when they're explained to the wrong audience. The doctor continued, outlining alternatives, emphasizing that nothing would move forward without my explicit consent. He spoke directly to me, checking in at each step, making sure I understood. I answered when needed, briefly and clearly, choosing precision over comfort. Every time the nurse wrote something down, she confirmed it with me. Every confirmation felt like a quiet repair. I noticed how the room had reoriented itself. Chairs angled toward me, screens turned in my direction, language adjusted. Not dramatically, naturally, as if the correction had always been waiting to happen. My sister sat quietly now, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wasn't angry, she wasn't defensive. She looked like someone recalculating, realizing that the ground beneath her had shifted and wouldn't shift back. I didn't feel satisfaction watching it happen. What I felt was distance, a clean separation between what belonged to me and what no longer did. The nurse mentioned a procedural detail tied to my decision, something that extended beyond this appointment. It had implications elsewhere. Records would need updating, designations reviewed, other assumptions might need correcting. She said it matter-of-factly, but I caught the significance immediately. My voice hadn't just paused one decision, it had triggered a chain reaction. "Will that affect anything else?" I asked. The nurse met my eyes. "It may," she said, "but we'll follow your direction." That sentence settled into me with unexpected weight. Follow your direction. For years, direction had flowed past me, around me, through someone else. Now it stopped here. The doctor confirmed next steps, reiterating that nothing further would happen without my involvement. He asked if I had any concerns. "I'll reach out if I do," I said. Again, no explanation, no apology. We stood to leave. The nurse handed me copies of the updated documentation, making sure I had them before anyone else did. When she placed them in my hands, she looked at me and smiled. a small professional gesture that carried more validation than she probably realized. My sister followed me out into the hallway, her steps slower than before. The noise of the hospital swallowed us immediately. Voices, carts, announcements overhead. Life moving on without acknowledging the shift that had just occurred. We walked in silence. Halfway down the corridor, she spoke. "I was just trying to help," she said softly. I stopped walking and turned to face her for the first time since the appointment ended. I kept my expression neutral, my voice even. "I know," I said, "but you don't get to decide for me." That was all. I didn't accuse her of anything. I didn't revisit the past. I didn't explain how long it had taken me to say that sentence without shaking. I didn't need to. She nodded once, slowly. She didn't argue. We continued walking. By the time we reached the exit, I understood something clearly. Speaking hadn't ended the story. It had set it in motion. The consequences of that moment would ripple outward, touching other decisions, other spaces where my silence had once been convenient. I wasn't afraid of that. For the first time, I trusted myself to handle whatever came next. As the doors slid open and the outside air hit my face, I felt steady. Not triumphant, not relieved, just anchored. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't defended my emotions. I hadn't needed anyone to agree with me. I had spoken once, carefully, and that had been enough to change everything. The hospital matter moved forward quietly after that, as if a correction had been made and no one felt the need to announce it. The nurse explained what would be updated, what would be reviewed, what would be paused. She spoke directly to me, checking in at each step, her tone careful but unburdened. The doctor confirmed that nothing would proceed without my written consent. The appointment ended not with drama, but with a sense of alignment, like a machine finally calibrated. It wasn't until later that I understood what else had shifted. A few days after the appointment, I received a call asking to verify information that had never been routed to me before. The woman on the line introduced herself politely, explained she was reviewing records connected to my file, and asked if I had a moment. "I do," I said. She asked questions that felt strangely overdue, about who should be contacted, about who was authorized to make decisions if I couldn't, about whether certain arrangements were still accurate. As she spoke, pieces fell into place with unsettling clarity. My sister's control hadn't been limited to the hospital room. It had extended into other areas, quiet ones, where decisions were made slowly and without much scrutiny. Places where being the default voice mattered more than having formal permission. What she had been protecting wasn't just efficiency, it was access. The woman on the phone mentioned a designation I hadn't thought about in years, something tied to long-term planning rather than immediate care. I asked her to repeat it, just to be sure I'd heard correctly. "Yes," she said. "It appears your sister has been listed as the primary contact for some time. Listed, not authorized." I thanked her and ended the call, sitting still for a long moment afterward. The room around me felt quiet, too quiet, as if it were waiting for me to react. I didn't feel angry, not in the way I might have expected. What I felt was a kind of cold understanding. The picture was clearer now, sharper around the edges. My sister hadn't been acting out of impulse or emotion. She had been maintaining a position. Being the one who spoke for me gave her leverage. It meant information reached her first. It meant systems defaulted to her judgment. It meant decisions flowed through her hands, shaping outcomes in ways that didn't require confrontation. She hadn't needed to lie. She had only needed no one to check. Over the next week, small confirmations continued to surface. Notices addressed to her instead of me. Updates I should have received directly. All of it framed as standard practice, the natural result of an arrangement no one had revisited in years. I corrected what needed correcting, slowly, methodically, without explanation. I didn't call my sister to confront her. I didn't accuse her of manipulation or intent. I didn't ask why she hadn't stepped back once I was able to speak for myself again. Those questions no longer felt necessary. The truth was already doing its work. When I did see her again, it was in a familiar setting, one where she would normally take the lead. She hesitated before speaking, glanced at me as if waiting for a cue, then fell silent. The shift was subtle, but it was there. She knew. She knew the access she'd relied on was dissolving. She knew the authority she'd carried couldn't be reclaimed with reassurance or familiarity. And she knew that saying too much now might expose more than she was willing to explain. I watched her carefully, not with satisfaction, but with curiosity. For years I had wondered whether I was imagining the imbalance, whether I was simply too passive, too accommodating. Now I saw how thoroughly the system had been tilted, and how easily it had accepted the tilt as normal. No one called it out. No one needed to. Institutions don't punish quietly corrected errors. They adjust, they move on. They leave people to reckon with the loss of advantage on their own. That was the part I hadn't expected. The consequences didn't arrive as confrontation or fallout. They arrived as silence, as doors that no longer opened automatically, as questions that could no longer be answered without my involvement. My sister tried once to frame it as a misunderstanding. She spoke carefully, choosing words that emphasized concern, habit, history. She stopped short of asking me to restore anything. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't hear her, but because the structure she was referring to no longer existed. There was nothing to restore. In the days that followed, I felt the effects of my decision ripple outward. Processes slowed, people asked before acting. Assumptions were replaced with verification. It was inconvenient at times, but it was honest. I realized then that what my sister had been protecting wasn't me. It was the ease of control. Letting go of that control meant accepting uncertainty, shared responsibility, and the possibility of being told no. It meant giving up a position that had become comfortable, even if it had never been formally granted. I didn't need to name that truth out loud for it to be real. As I updated my records, clarified my preferences, and reestablished boundaries, I felt something settle inside me. Not relief, not vindication, ownership. The story wasn't about exposing her, it never had been. It was about reclaiming a space that had quietly been taken and holding it without apology. By the time everything was properly aligned again, the hospital appointment felt like a distant memory, a single moment that had opened a much larger door. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't demanded explanations. I had simply insisted once on being the one who decided. And that insistence had undone far more than she ever expected. I didn't leave the hospital feeling victorious. I left feeling clear. There's a difference between the two. Victory demands an audience. Clarity only asks that you recognize where you stand. By the time the doors slid closed behind me and the sounds of the hallway faded, I knew something fundamental had shifted. Not because I had won an argument, but because the rules had quietly changed. The family noticed before anyone said it out loud. Phone calls came in differently after that. Questions replaced assumptions. Conversations paused, waiting for my response instead of moving past me. It was subtle at first, the way real change usually is, but it carried a weight I felt immediately. My sister especially moved more carefully. She didn't step forward the way she used to. When decisions came up, she hesitated, as if waiting for a signal that never arrived. The confidence that once filled every room she entered had softened into something cautious, measured. She listened more than she spoke. I didn't comment on it. There was no need to point out the reversal. Power that has to be announced isn't power at all. The fact that she felt it slipping without me saying a word told me everything I needed to know. The family dynamic adjusted around that absence. People who had once deferred to her now looked to me first. Not because they were trying to correct a mistake, but because they sensed where authority now belonged. Decisions slowed, but they also became more deliberate, less rushed. No one blamed her. No one blamed me. That was the strangest part. There was no reckoning, no confrontation scene where everything spilled out. The system simply corrected itself and the people inside it adapted. I watched it happen with a calm I hadn't felt in years. When my sister finally tried to reclaim some ground, it was tentative. She framed it gently, casually, as if testing whether the old patterns still held. "I can handle that if you want," she said one afternoon, referring to a matter she would have taken over without asking before. I met her eyes and smiled politely. "I've got it," I said. She nodded and stepped back. That was it. No argument, no resentment, just acceptance, or something close to it. The moment passed without drama, but it carried a finality she seemed to recognize. The door hadn't slammed, it had simply closed. I didn't feel the urge to gloat. If anything, I felt lighter. For so long I had carried the quiet burden of wondering whether I was too passive, too accommodating, too willing to let others decide for me. Now I understood the truth more clearly. Silence had never been my weakness. It had only been misused. There was one last attempt, a softer one, to return to the way things had been. My sister spoke about how stressful everything had become for her, how much responsibility she'd carried, how hard it was to let go of habits formed during difficult times. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "I appreciate what you've done, but I don't need that anymore." I didn't justify it. I didn't negotiate. She exhaled slowly and looked away. The conversation ended there. Inside me, something settled into place. Not anger, not triumph, but resolution. I realized I didn't need her to admit anything for this chapter to close. I didn't need apologies or explanations. I needed boundaries that held, and I finally had them. In the days that followed, I noticed how differently I carried myself. Not louder, not sharper, just steadier. When decisions came up, I didn't rush to fill the space. I took the time I needed, knowing that time no longer worked against me. I understood now that authority isn't something you seize in a single moment. It's something you maintain through consistency, through calm, through the refusal to surrender your place again. The family adjusted fully after that. Conversations found a new rhythm, expectations reset. The unspoken hierarchy that had once placed my sister above me dissolved into something more balanced, more honest. No one said, "You've changed." But I had. The biggest shift wasn't external, it was internal. I no longer felt the urge to explain myself. I no longer feared being misunderstood. I trusted my judgment in a way I hadn't before, and that trust showed. As I moved through my days, handling my affairs, making my choices, I felt grounded in a way that didn't require reinforcement. I didn't need permission. I didn't need validation. I had already given myself what I'd been waiting for from others. By the time everything settled, the hospital appointment felt like a distant memory, a catalyst rather than a climax. The real transformation had happened afterward, in the quiet adjustments, the unspoken acknowledgments, the new normal that no longer centered around someone else's voice. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need anyone to lose for me to win. I simply stopped losing myself. And that was enough to change the entire family dynamic without raising my voice once. Time passed, not dramatically but steadily, the way real change always does. Life didn't announce the new normal with a speech or a confrontation. It revealed itself in small moments, a pause before a decision, a question directed to me instead of past me, an email addressed to my name, not forwarded through someone else first. I noticed it most in the quiet. Conversations no longer moved around me, they moved with me. When plans were discussed, people waited. When choices needed to be made, they asked. Not because I demanded it, but because the boundary had settled into place and stayed there. My sister adjusted, slowly and without ceremony. She stopped filling silences. She stopped stepping in reflexively. When she spoke, it was as herself, not as my interpreter or my stand-in. The shift didn't come with apologies or explanations. It came with acceptance. That mattered more. I didn't need her to admit what she'd done. I didn't need the past dissected or justified. I needed the present to function differently, and it finally did. The line I had drawn wasn't loud or dramatic. It was consistent. And consistency, I learned, is what makes a boundary real. There were moments when the old pattern almost resurfaced. Habits don't disappear overnight. A familiar tone, a familiar suggestion. Each time I responded the same way, calmly, directly, without emotion attached. "I'll handle it." That was all it took. No argument followed, no tension lingered. The boundary held because I held it, not because anyone else agreed with it. What surprised me most was how little effort it required once I stopped negotiating my own authority. For years, I had believed that asserting myself meant conflict, that claiming space would come at the cost of harmony. The truth was simpler. Silence had only failed me when it was unintentional. Chosen silence was different. It was steady, grounded. It gave me time to think instead of react, to decide instead of defend. It allowed the systems around me to show their structure, and once I understood that structure, I knew exactly where my place was. I no longer rushed to explain myself. I no longer softened my words to be more acceptable. When I spoke clearly. When I didn't, it was because nothing needed to be said. The sense of control that came from that wasn't sharp or intoxicating. It was quiet, sustainable. It didn't need to be reinforced every day. It simply existed. Looking back, I realized the hospital appointment wasn't the moment I found my voice. It was the moment I stopped giving it away. I hadn't reclaimed it through confrontation or emotion. I had reclaimed it through documentation, patience, and the refusal to let assumptions stand unchallenged. I let the system do what it was meant to do, and in doing so, I learned how much power I'd always had. There's a lesson in that I carry with me now. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room to be heard. You don't have to explain your pain for it to be valid. And you don't have to prove your strength through conflict. Sometimes, strength is knowing when to wait. Sometimes, justice comes not from exposure, but from alignment. And sometimes, the most decisive moment of your life happens quietly, when someone finally looks at you and asks what you want. And you're ready to answer. If you've ever sat in a room where decisions were made about you without you, I want you to know this. Your silence doesn't mean consent. Your patience doesn't mean weakness. And your voice doesn't have to sound like anyone else's to matter. If this story felt familiar, if it stirred something you've lived through or are still living through, you're not alone. So many of us have been taught to step back, to let others speak, to keep the peace at our own expense. You don't have to do that forever. If you want to share your experience, I read every comment. This space exists for stories like yours, the quiet ones that don't always get told, but deserve to be heard. And if you'd like to stay with this channel, to hear more real stories about boundaries, dignity, and the kind of justice that doesn't require shouting, I hope you'll subscribe and come back. Some truths take time to surface, but when they do, they change everything, softly, permanently, and on your terms.